Former Connecticut Commissioner of Housing, Evonne Klein, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So, in addition to being the former Connecticut Commissioner of Housing, you are the former Darien First Select Woman. You have vast experience working on the issue of housing across Connecticut. So, I wanted to start this interview by getting a temperature check at the outset here. How is Connecticut doing in terms of dealing with the housing crisis, just generally speaking?
Sure. I mean, overall, having been involved in this issue for more than 20 years, which really seems like a long time, but my experience as a former first select woman here and then as commissioner and continuing to work on this issue as a housing consultant, I'd like to say we're getting there. And we're getting there. Certainly my time as first selectman, that was a very tenuous time for housing. Well, all right, let me just say it more directly. There were times where there were zero state dollars in the budget for housing, and Connecticut solely had to rely on federal funding and federal tax credits to build affordable housing. Fast forward, that all changed when Governor Malloy was elected and put real money, hundreds of millions of dollars in the state budget to help boost up the federal funding that Connecticut had. So certainly we're doing a lot better in terms of providing state funding, which is sorely needed to get the housing built. So I think we're doing a great job, and Governor Lamont has increased that funding annually. So all good movement there. I think in terms of legislation, as commissioner, it was very frustrating for me because we saw and recognized that unless zoning was going to change in the state, we wouldn't see any progress in housing. And for me, that was sort of the work that after we set up the Department of Housing and developed housing policy, developed programs on how to fund housing across the state, that was the thing we needed to continue to work on. And with Governor Malloy, we started that work. And I'm glad to see that legislation has been passed in the past 5, 6 years to advance housing and to change zoning and really importantly to start conversations that should be had locally about zoning and what their communities can be, what they can look like, and what they have to offer to individuals and families. So we're getting there. Legislators have said that they've made incremental progress. Clearly we are in a housing crisis, as is the whole country, and we need to be making more progress in the future, this year, next year. And there needs to be, some kind of a plan and vision in terms of housing and how we can make progress across the state.
So, before you were Connecticut Commissioner of Housing, like I said, you represented Darien. So this is a wealthy suburb. This is, as first selectman, I'm from Norwalk. I see the moves that Darien is now making, with the Corbin district and transit-oriented housing. Is Darien setting an example here for what can be done with mixed use, and what can still be worked on here?
I think so. We have conducted tours in town, walking tours of Norotan Heights and the downtown to highlight the good work that Darien is doing. And of course, there's always more to do. As you know, most of our cities and towns are single family home towns, right? The majority of the housing is single family homes. So I did some quick math this morning when I was thinking about talking with you. So I would say within the last 6 years, 500 units of housing have been approved, multifamily units of housing have been approved in Darien. That's a lot. And I think that's all good stuff. So it's not in one place. And I would invite any listener to reach out and come, and I'm happy to give a tour and talk about how this happened and how Darien is still a suburb. It still looks like Darien, right? Within thoughtful changes. Um, so we've we have an inclusionary zoning regulation in Darien, which means that there's once you hit four or more, you're building four or more units, 14% of those units need to be deed restricted affordable units. So, yes, we're getting a number of market rate units, but we're also getting some affordable units within those market rate units. So that's exciting. So we've had a number of projects that have come online in Norotan Heights, the Corbin district. I think half of the apartments have been built downtown. You'll see it on the Post Road, still under construction for the other half. Um, and then in other parts of town, um, off Post Road and along the Post Road, there's more construction ongoing for various sizes of multifamily. Clearly, there's more work to be done. Darien did pass an ADU regulation as of right on 1 acre or more with restrictions. So I think that has a 5 year timeline on it. They're going to look at it again in 5 years to see if folks have taken advantage of the new ADU. We have reduced our parking regulations some. I think there's more work to be done there. So, exciting things happening in town, and it's good to see thoughtful change within the vision of what the town is.
Absolutely. It is exciting, and you know, before you were even first selectman, you served on the Darien Board of Selectmen and Darien Board of Education. So you've been in this town working on these issues for a long time. Interacting with people who may not be on the same page as you on the issue of housing. I'd love to know what you've learned in talking with these people who, like I said, may not be on the same page as you, and not necessarily getting to a place of you're convincing them, but maybe you're kind of opening the door saying, hey, this is possible. Like clearly there's had to be some minds changed to get to where Darien is today. So what is that? What has been that process of opening that dialogue, respecting their potential differences in outlook? Because you know this is even a larger conversation in just Connecticut in general. Not every resident is on the same page as to what should be done with housing.
So, well, some of the things that I've learned, and I think most of what I learned about serving on a board, I learned on the Board of Education. So, anybody who would like to run for office, I always recommend make sure part of your service is on the Board of Education because I think you learn so much there. And one of the things I thought that we did well there was to really educate the public. So when we were faced with a number of applications with respect to affordable housing, the housing authority needed to renovate and expand one of their properties. As for selectmen, there were a few things I did. I took on educating the public and finding different ways and different topics with respect to affordable housing to educate not only the boards and commissions and the representative town meeting, but also the public, right? So I think education and putting forward facts is important. We formed an advisory commission with respect the Darien Affordable Housing Advisory Commission. I believe that was the name, and those folks did some really terrific work in terms of what kind of housing was needed in town. They did surveys of people who worked here. Would you like to live in, would you like to live in town? And it sort of came back that most of the folks who worked here would like to live in town and not have to have a big commute. So they did a great deal of work. Out of that group came a recommendation to have an inclusionary zoning regulation. And and also an affordable housing plan. So, so that was really important to do. I think education plays a part, and I also think fear in some ways plays a part. And I think, fear that a developer will come in here and try to build something that really isn't the best kind of development for Darien, um, might be too big and perhaps go to court and win an approval on that. So we've been very fortunate in this town to work with our developers uh, and to work with them on how, on a vision for the downtown and for various parts of the town. I hope that answers your question. With the inclusionary zoning regulation, we did clash with the Planning and Zoning Commission. That was a tough sell, but it was a necessary sell because the the Planning and Zoning Commission was really concerned about how much affordable housing we had and whether or not there is the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, 830G, which oftentimes scares municipalities that if you deny an application, and you don't have a moratorium or 10% of your housing as deed restricted affordable, that applicant can then challenge and go to court. So whether things happened out of fear or whether they happened because people were enlightened, um, honestly, I don't care because we have a need for affordable housing.
Yes,
So, sort of whatever gets the job done. I
absolutely.
certainly think there is a much greater awareness that multifamily is important to a community, mixed use is important to this community, and affordable housing is also important to this community. So, how people got there? Eh, they got there. So I'll take it. I'll take it, Jack.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's a matter of just, everyone wants, right, what's best for their kids, what's best for their family. They want the school they want the community they want the feel that they signed up for. And that's a natural instinct. But there are also these larger issues of saying, societally, how can we organize ourselves in a way that works for the most people? That's absolutely a conversation that I'm sure is continuing to happen across the state. Um, Recently, you were a part of a discussion regarding HB 8002 and the state of housing in New London. One of the questions, state of housing in Connecticut took place in New London. Um, you asked One of the questions you asked some of the your fellow panelists was how partisan the issue of housing had grown at the state level. It was universally HB 8002 was universally opposed by state Republicans, and this is in spite of the fact that both Democrats and Republicans faced high housing costs. There's not a coupon that Republicans hand their landlord or to get a discount. And also across the country, action on housing is a bipartisan issue. Um, why do you think that's different in the state of Connecticut?
Honestly, I've been asking myself that question for years, and that's why I ask it of panelists, especially of legislators who are, up in Hartford, and having these debates. And every time there's a housing bill and there's a debate, I watch and listen and take notes to hear what everybody is saying. I I don't know why there is this great divide. And I hope that's not a disappointing answer. But when we look at the polls, like this is the other thing, when we look at the polls, Republicans and Democrats alike, regular folks identify housing affordability. If it's not the number one issue, it's like the top three. But lately it's been the number one issue. So I don't know. I don't, it was like that when I was commissioner. Um, and I don't know where the disconnect is. Um, I've also seen legislators vote against, when I was commissioner, folks, legislators used to vote against the budget, and then they would show up at the ribbon cutting, which, for an afford and I was and, you know, no, don't show up. If you don't support, um, the funding, don't show up for the ribbon cutting. And you have Republican legislators who want to end homelessness, but will not support legislation that will lead to an increase in affordable housing, who will not support just cause eviction. That to me, I don't understand that. And there are no other I look, there's no magic bullet. We know that. It's going to take a number of actions to address our housing shortage. So that's number one. So there's no magic bullet. But for the folks who vote against some good ideas, what are your solutions? So we're not hearing solutions from the other side, um, to help folks with housing. And I'm a believer in housing as a human right and housing first. So when you have a home, so many things come with having a home, right? Your home is your foundation. So how how we don't even see that eye to eye, I don't understand it. I really don't understand it, and I do spend time listening, trying to find that way, where we can meet. Always comes the but. I agree with you, but this isn't the answer. Well, what is the answer? What is 1/8 of the answer? And we're not getting that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so tough because it does feel like, in theory, that a lot of the solutions, and they do at the voter level and across the country, do appeal to the instincts of political ideology across the spectrum. You have, rental assistance program, which is more of like a subsidy kind of thing, where that's
Mhm.
like a spending. You have, something like parking minimums, which I think from a conservative perspective could be pitched um, as an unfunded mandate being removed. This is, you know, there's a little something for everyone, and so I it is frustrating, but I do hold out hope that there'll be some light switch, because it really is not a partisan issue in almost any other context. Even at the local level, you had at Lamont's Governor Lamont's press conference of HB 8002, you had I believe it was the North Haven First Selectman Michael Freda speak and talk about how this is a good bill. So I guess we'll stay tuned on that one. So the housing bill represents a lot of momentum for the pro homes movement. People like Senator Martha Marks. We've talked to Senator Bob Duff. We talked to Representative Cavros DeGraw and Representative Rojas. These are real housing champions. By the time I began to get involved in this movement in like 2022, this movement and its members already had legs and were on its way to passing something as large as HB 8002. And we refer to that bill at ProHome CT as a great start. But it is a more of a start than has been. And it didn't come out of nowhere. I'd love to hear some context from you, someone who has been in that fight longer than I have, as how this came to be, and sort of what the work has been like to form this movement, and why now is the time that it kind of comes together in this way.
Well, I think, thank goodness now is the time that it's come together, right? So that's great. I think with respect to the bill, what we saw, um, as part of the bill were just concepts that were raised, and oftentimes bills that were called over the years that had public hearings. Um, I think a component of that bill was the Majority Leaders Roundtable on housing, opening up that communication with all kinds of folks across the state, to hear about concerns, um, and how can they be be addressed. So I think, looking at this from years, the history of what they all saw come before them, what we all championed or supported, over the years, combined with the reality of today. I think with the work that's being done in terms of the Majority Leaders Roundtable and other outreach efforts across the state to have conversations about housing, I think that led to the bill coming together again. And I think there's also a recognition that there is no magic bullet here. And we're going to have to come at this at a number of different ways. And part of this is a big, local conversation in the bill where decisions are going to be made locally. There are no mandates. You can opt out. I mean, I'm gonna say something. I'm a mandate person at this point. That's my frustration. But this is a bill that I think again listened to local leaders, listened to state representatives, listened to the people, and came together in a very thoughtful way. And the planning aspect is huge, which gives a municipalities time to be thoughtful and plan and provide some funding. That's another thing you always hear about, right? Funding. So I think, yes, it's a great start. We're getting there, and it does give. I think it gave voice to a lot of the concerns, and they were remedied.
I'd love to chat a little bit because you're alluding to the real kind of meat of this bill. Um, a part of this bill is everything from regional and local housing growth planning system, removal of parking minimums, to a ban of algorithmic rent setting, an expansion of fair rent commissions. Are there any specific sort of parts of this bill, whether I've mentioned them in these, four I listed or not, that stick out to you as important and needed changes for Connecticut to have adopted?
Um, I think uh, to be, my wonky self here. I think the planning part, developing housing growth plans. I think, you're probably gonna say, "Why?" Well, that's crazy that but I don't think towns have s have spent and spend enough time, making plans. And you could say, "Well, we've got volunteers, there's only so much time." But I think that opportunity to really put thought into the direction the town is going to take is really, really important. And, I could have done it all along, but sometimes it takes something like this to come along to really shine a light on what the opportunity a town can take. And, I've had a number of conversations with our first selectman about 8002, some of his thoughts about housing. Um, so I think without this bill, I think that would not be happening. And I think it's happening more and more across communities. So for me, that's that's the important part where communities can galvanize, form their vision, and make their plan and execute it. And oh, by the way, there's new funding to help you do that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the conversation around the idea of local control. What is local control if not being able to create a plan for your municipality and how you address the needs of your residents? Um,
So
uh,
I'd like to just address that because
yeah.
that's a little bit, that's a phrase I don't use. So for
Mm.
all these years in government, that is not a phrase I don't use. Um, I think it's in some ways a very inaccurate term. Because municipalities have local authority to make decisions, to make a whole lot of decisions, but for purpose of this conversation, to make zoning decisions, to form zoning boards, to form planning and zoning boards, to make regulations. There's a whole lot and the Zoning Enabling Act, a whole lot of authority that the Zoning Enabling Act gives over to municipalities. And I think that, and that was one of the first things I learned when I was first selectman. Our town attorney, in his wisdom, had a conversation with me about the Zoning Enabling Act. And so this whole notion of local control and it's being taken away, it's like, hold on, your local authority still exists. You still have all of those responsibilities outlined in the Zoning Enabling Act. What are you concerned about? Applications are still going to go before your local planning and zoning commission that is comprised of either folks elected from your town or appointed from your town. They will review that application in accordance with your local regulations and they will make a decision. So, like, where are you losing your authority here? And oh, by the way, the state kind of tells you what you can and cannot do in that act. So if you get another regulation, it's not any different from what's already
Right.
in the Zoning Enabling Act. So I have a whole lot of issues with that. And, it'd be interesting to know how many decisions have been made in a courtroom versus, or by the court versus your local planning board. So I would
Yeah.
say very few. So again, when you look outside at your community, just know 90+% of those decisions were made locally, not by the state,
Absolutely.
not by the court. They were made by your neighbors. So I hope that isn't off track for you, but it's a real bugaboo of mine, um, because as I said, I think local control is just an inaccurate way to describe the authority that cities and towns have over their decision making.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important point. I mean, we were told that HB 8002 would take away local control, and then this year you have SB 151 making its way through, allowing a change in setback requirements as part of the bill, to allow for more starter homes. And then the same groups come out there and say local control is going to be taken away if this bill passes, and it's like, wait, I thought it was gone in last year, and it's really, it's wrong. The structures, as you're talking about, are still in place and they're not going to change. And no one's proposing that they fundamentally change. So it's important that you bring that up. Very much not a sidetrack. It's critical because, you know, you can't, it's like at a certain point, it's like boy who cried wolf, it's local control is staying in place. And at the same time, we're going to be able to deal with the housing crisis.
Right. Your authority to regulate your zoning locally will stay in place. And I think I do want to go back on 151 in terms of that's a little, I could see where folks in a community would be a little nerve-wracked by that particular bill, because yeah, setbacks, what does that mean? I think it's really important for local communities to have that conversation. If you're a community that has a minimum of 2-acre zoning, maybe you want to have that conversation. Do we still in the 21st century need to be a community with a minimum of 2 acres? Are there parts of our town where we could, you know, maybe say, hey, this is like other municipalities have done. This is where our 1/4 acre zones are. This is where our 1/3 acres are. You know, is it time for certain communities to have that conversation? And that's a question. And I hope that bill will really provoke that kind of local conversation and that visioning. And again, it really goes back to that housing growth plan, right? Like it all sort of goes back to that kind of conversation. What's your vision? What are you thinking? How can we provide housing? And when you look at the statistics of our cities and towns, in most of our cities and towns, at least 30% of our people are really facing serious challenges with being able to afford their housing. And that's among homeowners. Renters, it's 50%. So if you know you have folks in your community who would either, who are elderly, would like to downsize, or folks who are just struggling day to day to have more housing options at various price points, that just only makes for a better community. And, again, as a public servant, sort of doing your job and meeting the needs of the folks in your community.
Yeah, it's important because it touches everybody. Like we're not at a point, and it was this conversation I had with Majority Leader Rojas, where he's saying part of the reason that we've gotten to this point where the housing crisis is starting to be addressed through sweeping legislation is the fact that it is now like it's reaching the middle and upper levels of society where someone like me who's from a place in Norwalk on the Rowayton side of Norwalk whose family is fairly well off can still has to really worry about saying, okay, I'm coming out of college, like am I going to be able to afford to buy a home in my future? So I want to kind of speak to the person who may not yet be a part of this pro homes movement. As we've talked about, you're not new to this space. The path to large housing bills like HB 8002 has not always been clear, but it goes to show that change isn't always linear. It takes a while, but it's still worth it to be involved. How would you frame the necessity to be involved to someone who's sympathetic to this issue, but is kind of pessimistic about our capacity to really deal with it when they look at the price of a home in their community? It sort of how do we motivate people to get involved who are looking at these prices and are worried about their communities?
Well, I think that without folks coming forward and stepping up, I always say the naysayers always come out. They always come out. And I do know now through a lot of polling that they're in the minority. They're not the majority of folks. And if the majority would come out, I think you'd see more rapid change. I think this is something, the housing issue, I've heard legislators say, oh, that's a third rail. I have to be careful. I have to stay away from it. They're worried about their vote. Are they going to get reelected? And local folks too. But I would say that unless you're speaking up, y- you're not going to see change. Because when elected officials, having been an elected official, having worked in Hartford and hearing this over, and over the years, right? eh, You know, we hear from people. And if their constituents are not saying, vote for 8002 or vote for 151, and I'm not promoting that, but, just using examples, they're not going to do it. They're gonna say, "I haven't heard from anybody. I don't know where my community stands," or, "I only heard from people saying, 'Vote no.'" And you're gonna see that. So, listen, change is going to happen, um, but we need to we need to be making our voices clear and continue with that. And I'm gonna also say this: run for office. Run for your local planning and zoning commission. Get involved in your community so that whatever land use board you have there, take a shot. Run for state office. Don't be afraid to speak out and step out on this issue. I think it's really, really important to do that. Hey, I
Yeah.
wouldn't be here talking to you today if I weren't that eternal optimist that change can happen, and it's worth the time. And I think I've seen more housing legislation the past several years than I had in like 15 years. So I think that is an excellent sign. But speak loudly, don't be afraid, speak often, and if you're not seeing the results you want, you do it. You run for office. You step up. You be the solution.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, advice and wisdom. It really is, the case that if you're not you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that there wouldn't be a pro homes movement if there wasn't hope for a pro homes future. Um, Former Connecticut Commissioner of Housing, Evonne Klein, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you.